Nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to researcher Maryanne Spurdle about her latest column. Maryanne, welcome along to the podcast.
Hi, Jason.
Great to have you with us. We are talking about your latest column, A Government That Divides Us Won't Stand. Now, this is sort of a post-mortem on the election with a twist, right? Because it seems amongst all the other post-mortems and things that we've discussed, there's reasons that are given, cost of living crisis, wealth tax being dropped as Labour dropped their support because they dropped so many policies. But it seems like there's one thing that we're not allowed to talk about. And so I wonder if we're going to get in trouble doing this podcast. But tell us, what is this thing?
There's this odd silence. I mean, you've got all the usual suspects, and all those things definitely played into the results. But when you've got Labour dropping half of its support from the last election, something
65 seats to 34 seats. Yeah, that's a big deal.
Something big happened.
What was it in the last 3 years? Yeah.
Thousands of people actually descended on Parliament, quite specifically, for weeks.
Yes.
And it was a big deal. And then they were all forced to go home. And I think the narrative has been that, that's over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
was last year.
Forget about that. Yeah. That doesn't factor into the post-mortem.
The interesting thing is, if you look at the numbers showing what percentage of the population thinks we're headed in the right direction and the wrong direction, the numbers start plummeting late 2021 when the policies that triggered the protests happened. Yeah. And from early 2022, it's just a nice, steady slide. Yeah. We're heading in the wrong direction. So if you want to look at a turning point, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But nobody seems to be mentioning it.
No, because it seems to be the narrative around it is that it was like this right-wing, alt-right, imported, fringe American kind of
nothing to do with what was going on in New Zealand.
Yeah. But the stats tell a different story, right? So tell us, what do the stats say?
A poll of the protesters came back, there are almost twice as many Labour supporters as National supporters.
Wow.
That tells you something. 30% of the people there, Labour.
Wow.
Voted Labour in 2020.
Yeah.
So either they were very effectively brainwashed
by these right-wing conspiracies.
Or it was not a particularly right-wing event.
Yeah,
16% were Greens voters. Only 16%, same as Greens, were National voters.
Wow.
Ethnically.
So half of the number of protesters were National as Labour.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like totally.
Yeah.
And then you add the Greens on that, that's like 46%. Almost half of them are left-leaning protesters.
Yeah, at least 46% were left-leaning.
Right. Yeah.
And then ethnically, 27% were Maori, larger than the percentage of the population. Yeah. So they're probably not going to show up for a racist event.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. So I think the narrative was off. Labeling them as fringe, unimportant, when actually they were very representative of the whole country.
Yeah.
And what brought them together was actually, as the poll showed, objection to mandates and support for people with vaccine injuries. Yeah. Those were the reasons for being there. Yeah. So the presence of some fringe actors, it's not insignificant, but it was not the reason that people showed up.
Yeah.
And I think that those people were representative of a whole lot of people who didn't vote Labour this time around.
So you say in your column that Labour effectively lost this election 2 years ago because of the vaccine mandates and the lack of support for the vaccine injured.
Vaccine passports. The division, basically. They made us choose sides. Yeah. They made us split into vaccinated and unvaccinated. Yeah. And they didn't have to do that. Yeah.
I remember kind of the reality of this when my son hadn't got his vaccine pass yet, and we went to a cafe and we weren't allowed to even wait for our takeaway drinks in the cafe. We had to wait outside.
Yeah.
And it was just like so foreign to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons that I suspect what I suspect about this is I didn't get vaccinated.
Yeah.
My husband was mandated.
Yeah.
I know people who got vaccinated who didn't want to, but they didn't have much of a choice because if you're a teacher, you can't just go get another job.
Yeah, but no one forced them, right?
So when Chris Hipkins said, oh, well, everybody had a choice recently, a whole bunch of us went, yeah, we remember making that choice.
Yeah.
And it was not a pleasant one to make.
Yeah.
In my case, my dad got severe blood clots after he got his jab. And I'm steadily inheriting most of his health ailments. So I went, actually, I'm not going to do this. And I was looking at data coming in from overseas. I already knew it wasn't stopping spread. You know, there were plenty of reasons that went into it. But to call somebody who made that decision someone who doesn't care about their neighbor or stupid, you know, all these labels were flying around at the time. Yeah. And it wasn't helpful.
Builds resentment and division, right? Yeah.
Well, and this is the thing. It wasn't just unhelpful. They should have known better.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stood out to me when the policies were first announced, there is a bioethicist named Angela Ballantyne, who I think was formerly an advisor to the government. She wasn't at the point that Q&A interviewed her.
Yeah.
And the reason is because she wasn't saying what they wanted to hear.
Oh, of course, yeah.
She said on Q&A, I think a major risk with the vaccine certificates or passports is that they are divisive. We, at all costs, want to avoid stigmatizing certain sectors of New Zealand, pushing them further to the margins, labeling them as a threat for the rest of us. This was 4 or 5 months before the protests, and she called it.
Yeah, totally.
They didn't have to go that direction. They did, and then they doubled down when there were problems. So then you've got the protesters there not being engaged with by the government, not only not being talked to, but you've got Trevor Mallard harassing them.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can disagree with the legitimacy of them being there, but the way he handled it, it made everything worse. Yeah. And I was just reading another post-mortem by a left-wing blogger who, even though he doesn't agree with the protesters at all, also thinks Trevor Mallard handled it abysmally.
Yeah. The music and the sprinklers and the ignoring. Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of the state of what the government currently is inheriting, the new government.
Yeah.
How might they build some unity back after this?
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
I think on the plus side, a lot of this is just simply not doing unhelpful things.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Don't put things out there that are going to pit people against each other. If you're going to do something that has a divisive element, try to bring people with you. Have discussions. Talk to the people you disagree with. Listen to the people you disagree with.
I was going to say, listen to your advisors who tell you, like, this is going to be divisive instead of firing them.
Yeah, especially your own advisors, you know, let alone the other ones. Yeah. I don't know how much of an advisor Angela Ballantyne was, but she was in those circles. And so listen to those kinds of voices. I think that's definitely part of it. And then one of the interesting things that happened with the protests was Winston Peters showed up.
Yeah.
So he'd been in government with Labour. He was out as of 2020. And so he was kind of free to show up, and unlike the others who were kind of pretty much banned from talking to the protesters. If you see Winston Peters going somewhere to pick up votes, you should probably pay attention because he's savvy. Jacinda Ardern is savvy. And the fact that she stepped down at the beginning of the year and that Winston Peters showed up last year and courted those people's votes, that's a really good windsock. Shows you which direction the wind's blowing. And I think for this government, they need to be very careful of dismissing, because society is quite divided.
Yeah.
And writing off a segment because you think they're not your support base, that's risky, and I don't think it's wise.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to bring people together. I think if the government does try to bring people together, even though everybody isn't going to be on the same page, if people feel listened to, then you're a big step ahead of where we were last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good thoughts, Maryanne. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Jason. Various postmortems have dissected Labour's failures between 2020's spectacular rise and this October's sound defeat. However, the largest public uprising in a generation barely got a mention, with a recent piece from the Daily Telegraph a rare exception. There are two narratives that explain why protesters overtook Parliament's grounds in February 2022. One is that lockdowns and mandates were necessary, but bad actors spread lies to convince the gullible that their government was against them. The other is that the government's policies lacked the ethical and scientific basis to justify that level of control over people's lives. So the people worse affected, and those close to them, who had actually experienced job losses or injuries, rebelled. What influence did dreaded right-wing extremists really have? A poll of the protesters found that 30% had supported Labour in 2020. Both Greens and National supporters represented 16% each. Ethnically, 27% were Maori. And the most common motivation for the protesters of all stripes was, in fact, opposition to vaccine mandates and support for the injured. Labour effectively lost this election 2 years ago without any help from conspiracy theorists. Polls show that by early 2022, voters increasingly believed the country was heading in the wrong direction. Rather than change course, the government began consuming its own PR. Policies designed to create two classes were for our own good. And the policies weren't causing real suffering. The discontent was founded on lies, which those who had elected the government wouldn't be silly enough to believe. The government stopped listening to anyone who didn't support its narrative. Back in October 2021, bioethicist and former advisor Angela Ballantyne questioned the wisdom of policies that split us into vaccinated and unvaccinated. She says, "I think a major risk with the vaccine certificates or passports is that they are divisive," she said on Q&A. "We, at all costs, want to avoid stigmatizing certain sectors of New Zealand, pushing them further to the margins, labeling them as a threat for the rest of us." 5 months later, as smoke wafted over Parliament, it appeared that she was right. Footage from the final day of the protest shows Rowenia Tarito and another Maori elder seated in the Kaumatua tent. Around them, every other structure has been torn down or burned. Officers make awkward attempts to remove them, but soon give up. Rowenia, interviewed in River of Freedom, recalled how former Speaker of the House Trevor Mallard approached them next. "Come inside for a cuppa," he offered. "Bring your cuppa here," she replied. "Hell no," Trevor said, laughing at the idea. Then, she said, he walked off to survey the wreckage. He was still laughing. The incoming government has a momentous task ahead, but the real test may have little to do with inflation or GDP. Many Kiwis are waiting to see if this government will listen to those with whom it disagrees, include those who have been left out, and work towards unity. The story of the 2023 election is simply this: a government that divides us will not stand.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.